Now the owners and employers have become a bit more clever. They might pay a person and even put it through their bank account properly, but then we'll go with them down to the ATM machine, and we've got evidence of where they stand over them so that they take the money out and give it back to the employer. So unbelievable things happening in New Zealand regarding exploitation of migrant workers.
Hi, this is Bruce Lipton, and you're listening to Green Planet FM.
Kia ora, greetings, and welcome to Green Planet FM 104.6. I'm Tim Lynch, and I trust that you are doing well. I invite you to stay with me over the next hour as we discuss and find ways to take care of our unique and magnificent green planet Earth.
Kia ora and welcome. I'm Lisa Eyre and this is Green Planet FM. Can we change the way we do business? Why are unions essential in the protection of workers? Over the past 30 years, more than 350 billion has flowed out of New Zealand's economy to overseas banks and foreign owners of our assets. In the same time, the share of the economy going to working people has fallen from over 50% to just over 40%, cutting 20 billion a year from pay packets. That is not a coincidence. Reducing employment rights, and more specifically reducing the rights of New Zealanders to build economic power, has led to a massive transfer of wealth away from the majority of Kiwis, our families, our communities, and small businesses. New Zealand needs to move away from our reliance on low-wage economy where companies compete by paying people less. We need to remove the temptation to throw more cheap labour or longer work hours at a problem and make investments in skills, productive capital and innovation the better option. Too many decisions about the work we do nowadays are made outside of employment law altogether. You see it for the people who are pushed to become dependent contractors and take all of the risks and little of the rewards. That's tens of thousands of drivers, utility technicians and construction workers over the past decade alone. You see it in the boardroom level decisions to re-tender whole workforces on lower terms and conditions by charging contractors, even though they end up largely employing the same people. As you see it with casual temp labour, most often via offshore-owned labour hire agencies, contracted by the real employer with little responsibility for employment conditions and no job security. Put simply, there are too many loopholes and too many people are falling through them. There is little doubt for many New Zealanders, perhaps even the majority of New Zealanders, that work can be better, a lot better. In the long run, strong, stable jobs provide the basis for adaptable, resilient New Zealanders, and they'll need to be to meet the challenges of the future of work. If we get that right, we won't just do well in our work, we'll do well in the world. Today, I'm interviewing Robert Reid. Robert is president of the 28,000-strong First Union after retiring as their general secretary in November of last year. He will be talking about his life, his work in trade unions, the community, and the role of trades unions today. Robert has recently been appointed to the government's Welfare Experts Advisory Group. Welcome, Robert. Now, Robert, I'd really like to emphasise the importance of unions in this interview. So, can you tell me, how did you first get involved in unions?
I guess I get involved at school when I heard that people in other parts of the country were forming secondary school students' associations. In fact, it was Catherine Delahunty, who a former Green MP, that formed the first one at Onslow College in Wellington. And hearing about that and believing that people needed to work together to achieve justice for themselves, a group of us in Dunedin formed the Otago Secondary Students Association, or OSSA as we called it, which I think is Latin for bone. That was the beginning. And interestingly enough, in doing that, it wasn't necessarily for me a great... I wouldn't have described myself as a radical. In fact, I came from a National Party family, but my father died when I was 12, but had been a Presbyterian minister. So I guess it's the social justice part of what he would say the social justice gospel that I took from those short 12 years with him, and that influenced me forming a secondary school students association. Then going to university, Lincoln College first. I became involved in those students' associations, became vice president of the New Zealand University Students Association when I was still in my first year at university. Because at that time we also had compulsory military service. It was during the Vietnam War. We then formed another organisation called the Organisation to Halt Military Service, or OMS. And instead of encouraging people to become conscientious objectors, we encouraged them and did it ourselves. We simply refused to register for military service as a form of civil disobedience. So I guess all of those things from secondary school to university to forming OMS was a precursor for my involvement later in life in the trade union movement.
Right. Well, that sounds a little bit similar to some of the things I've done. But that's great. So you're obviously always politically aware of social justice. And to my mind, that's what seems to be a little bit missing at the moment is the enthusiasm for social justice. People will say tusk and turn their backs. And the whole idea of people getting together politically is almost not PC in many settings.
Yes, I think certainly I can remember right from even before what I described, but in primary school I can barely remember, but my mother had told the story later that I used to set up a bring and buy stall outside our house to raise money for the starving millions overseas. So, and it was just almost second nature for us at that time to do that. I think with Rogernomics, as we call it in New Zealand, but Thatcherism, Reaganomics, the whole neoliberal experiment, not experiment, but now the whole neoliberal way that the world operates. People tell us, and I think they're right, that, of Generation X, Y, Z, the millennials certainly have much of a more me-first attitude than those of us who, I guess, were the baby boomers or the post-war generation, where there was still that element of decency, of community, of sticking together, of trying to achieve things collectively rather than just looking after number one.
I would agree with that, and I think possibly the advertising that we've had, you deserve this, that you're number one, the whole individual type of me first is very strong, right. Really. Mm. I don't know how we change that at this stage, but without a big change in ethics, I know Jacinda has suggested that we have a government of kindness. We need a society of kindness, actually.
Right. A society of kindness actually would be a very good start. I mean, those of us in the trade union movement are by sort of nature socialists, but the first principle of even before socialism for me is that people should be kind and good to each other, and that would, when we're looking today, of course, at the housing crisis, the health crisis, the funding crisis, all of those things, the absolute appalling stuff that happened to families being thrown out of their houses because of bogus P tests. Yes, we need to move to a society which is much more gentle, much more kind. Some people might think, oh, that's funny coming from a trade unionist because there are these terrible people that go on strike all the time. But I think as we'll continue today, we'll find out that really social justice is the basis of the trade union movement, and it's something that we certainly strive for on behalf of our members.
Well, we're certainly going to have a time of people having opinions about trade unions and striking with the nurses that's coming up. I don't believe they're their own union, aren't they? But they're digging their toes in and saying no. And the way the media is presenting it sounds as though they're going to get a really big pay rise. And some of the more senior nurses will, but I believe that the junior nurses won't. And so they're all sticking together and saying, look, we haven't had a pay rise in years and we really want to insist on this. And different people have different ideas as to whether that's appropriate or not.
Yeah, very much. And I guess in some ways the tragedy is that it was the previous government that kept those wages down, and in fact the top has now come off the pressure cooker. If anyone was to blame for the fact that nurses' wages are so far behind, it is not the government, if you like, that they're going to go on strike against now. It is the government that, and I remember when while we on behalf of low-paid workers, were still able to achieve wage rises over the last 9 years of between 2 and 4% every year. Nurses, some years were getting nothing, some years were getting 1%, and I think what we're seeing now is the pressure of that is leading them to say, no, we're no longer prepared to stand for that, and we need a very decent pay rise now.
I have a daughter-in-law who's a nurse, so I'm definitely on their side. But it was always difficult when teaching, because I was in the NZEI, the teachers' union, primary teachers' union, and it was, do we strike? What's going to happen to the children that haven't got anyone at home? And who can stay at school and look after those children if we strike? It's a juggling act with the nurses. Can we organise it so that
Yes,
people
exactly.
don't suffer?
And in some ways in those professions, particularly in health and nurses, because even of their professional oaths and beliefs, it becomes more of a symbolic activity, although hospitals, apart from the people in them, will be closed for that day. But certainly strikes are the last resort for all workers, not the first resort. And I think if any time that you hear that people are going strike, we need to look back as to what has caused that. And we're saying for the nurses, it's been something building for 9 years. Our union is not afraid of striking. We've been doing it all the time over the last 9 years. We are a private sector union, and sometimes, we've needed and continue to need to take that action. But that action is a result of us believing that usually wage bargaining has been going nowhere, and companies are not able or not prepared to pay good or decent wages. And as you've said in your introduction, the share of the cake that has gone to wages for workers has been cut over the last 10 or 20 years by about 10%. And so it's not a matter of workers being greedy, it's a matter of workers needing to struggle very hard to get decent wages and to get back their share of the economy, which they did have 20 years ago.
Yes, 20 years ago, you never heard the phrase the working poor, did you?
No, and that is what we're finding now, that those people, those NGOs and charities that were running, we never heard of food banks either, but after the benefit cuts around 1992, we certainly saw a huge increase in poverty of those on benefits, but that has been followed by an increasing poverty of those who are working, sometimes not being able to even work for 40 hours a week. And that's part of the problem, that workers and the ones we represent, unless we have it in their union negotiated collective agreement what the guaranteed hours are, many employers think that they can just bring workers on or off, turn them on or off a bit like a tap. And that's why we saw, about 3 years ago, when our sister union Unite ran that very good campaign against 0 hours, and and to all intents and purposes, we have got rid of 0 hours, but we still have the problem of not zero, but low contracted hours, so that we are now finding, and groups like Budget Advice Centres and others are telling us that more and more of the people that are using food banks are workers and part of the working poor rather than beneficiaries. So that is a huge thing that we actually have to look at, and as both a trade unionist and also, as you mentioned, by being on the government's the welfare experts advisory group, we need to look at both of those areas to ensure that people have an adequate income to have a good and happy life. In fact, why else are we on this planet but to actually have a life that is fulfilling and good for ourselves and our children?
Well, there's about a $4 gap between the minimum wage and a living wage, isn't there? There is,
and for a long time we have had the minimum wage, and our union argues very strenuously every year and makes submissions for the minimum wage to go up. But about 4 years ago, unions, particularly at that time the Service and Food Workers Union, came up with the idea of us. We've always talked about struggling for a living wage, but of actually putting a dollar figure on that. And they contracted the Family Centre in Wellington and the economist group Burl to look at that and come up with a figure. And it's interesting, that figure really has not been challenged by anyone. Possibly even on their own admission, it may be on the low side, and they purposely did that, but you're absolutely right. The figure that the economists came up with, that a family where the breadwinners, 1.5 breadwinners in the family is what they calculated, the dollar figure that was actually needed was, it's been increasing now. Now it's over $20 an hour. Whereas the minimum wage, has just gone to $16.50 an hour.
Yes. So the minimum wage really isn't suitable for large numbers of people, and yet low wages seem to be absolutely rife for people doing quite responsible jobs.
It is, and again, our sister union Unite reports that they organise workers in the fast food area, and some of those are shift managers with responsibilities for the till, for locking up, responsibilities for the staff while they're there, and in many cases of the fast food chains, they are paid little more than the minimum wage for having such responsibilities. So New Zealand is in a low-wage country, a low-wage economy, and we are actually seeing not just unions and, I guess, political parties of the left calling that out, but also even in Australia, where workers are paid a lot more than New Zealand, even the Reserve Bank there has said that low wages in Australia are now partly responsible for the economic decline of that country. So it's not just us saying it. It's been said by all sorts of economists and economic commentators that wages do have to go up substantially. So we were very happy and looking forward to what was the three coalition partners, New Zealand First, Greens and Labour, in the end came up with the figure of the minimum wage by 2021 needing to come up to over $20. That is good, but we actually need to be looking at other means as to how we can actually increase wages of workers in New Zealand.
Most definitely, and I feel a lot of the companies that are really fleecing workers are actually from overseas, including Australia, I may say. And I feel that there's like no care, no responsibility. Well, we'll give them that much. You know, if they can't manage to feed their family on that, it's too bad.
I feel that as well. Some people, because I've argued that and haven't had an argument back, saying when they do all of the statistics, they might find that multinational companies are paying more than local companies. But the reason in some ways for that is that they make a hell of a lot more profit. So they can afford to pay more, but that has to be struggled for. And in many cases, whether it's the big banks, it's the other big Australian companies that are here. In 1991, when the government brought in the Employment Contracts Act, they used this fraudulent argument is that it was let's take unions out of the picture because unions are keeping wages down, they said, and the Employment Contracts Act will allow the profitable firms to pay their workers more without unions keeping wages down. Well, that was a completely rubbish argument. And the profitable companies today, when we go and bargain with them and say, and with a very reasonable wage demand, and even if they've made, say, a 20% increase in profit, they will come back to us and say, no, we're not prepared to pay anything more than what the market is paying for this year. And the market might be paying, they say, 2% or 2.5%. So it's rubbish what we've been dealt with. Unions and workers coming together collectively to bargain their wages and conditions is really one of the only mechanisms that have kept wages up and kept wages above the minimum wage over the last few years. And the fact that our wages have fallen behind Australia and other countries in many ways is because the unions in New Zealand since 1991 have gone from about 60% density now to under 20%, and so our power to actually do stuff about wages and conditions has been reduced as well. But our union, First Union, has actually been able to grow after the 9 years with the national government, and it really, we believe that if you really concentrate and put your mind to it, then workers do respond. Workers will come and join our union if they see what we are doing is of benefit to them.
Well, I hope so, particularly a lot of migrants who don't want to get into trouble, who want to keep their heads down, who want to feel that, yes, they're blending into New Zealand society, may be a little reticent in joining unions, but it's important that they see the reason for this.
You're very right, and I think everybody would acknowledge that First Union is the union taking the lead on migrant issues in New Zealand. So much so that my replacement of General Secretary of our union is Dennis Maga, who is a migrant worker from the Philippines. He was active in unions there and has come here and has been and now risen to the position of General Secretary in First Union. What he has been doing before that position in our union over the last 8 or 9 years has been setting up the migrant section of our union. People have probably seen him on television leading often unions going into restaurants, our union going in there and exposing in front of usually a TV3 cameraman what is happening, the exploitation that's going on in those places. So our union puts very highly the need to be organising with migrant workers. Often what we find with migrant workers is that, yes, there is some of them are scared. Some of them have a right also to be scared because the visa that they are on is a visa which determines they have to work for a particular employer. So in fact, they are bonded labour. the same bonded labour that we accuse the Indian government of allowing over the centuries to happen in India, we are having here. So, and a group of our workers, of our organisers, just 2 weekends ago, went down to Queenstown, where we had some members, but not as, on average, not as many as we have in other parts of the country, density-wise. And yes, they got quite a few people joining, a lot of people interested, but we know that Queenstown, probably even more than Auckland, has a higher number of migrant workers down there. The main reason for people not joining is that they were scared that if they did and the employer found out that they would lose their job, and then if they lost their job, they would lose their visa for New Zealand. So before Labour got in, we had been talking to Ian Lees-Galloway and are continuing to talk to him after. We are wanting to see changes made so that migrant workers aren't going to work scared every day. And because if they don't blow the whistle on some of the terrible practices that are happening, like wages being stolen immediately after a worker might now be paid the minimum wage. Some of them are not even being paid that in restaurants and some other places. Now the owners and employers have become a bit more clever. They might pay a person and even put it through their bank account properly, but then we'll go with them down to the ATM machine, and we've got evidence of where they stand over them so that they take the money out and give it back to the employer. So unbelievable things happening in New Zealand regarding exploitation of migrant workers, but you are quite right. It is something, in some countries unions are not so good at standing up for migrants as well as local workers. We are very proud of the fact that not only our union, but all other unions, or most other unions in New Zealand, are treating migrant workers as workers and are sticking up for them as well as New Zealand-born workers.
Right. Well, I mean, even immigrants rather than migrants, that have actually got residency here, still are often quite nervous because they have no fallback if they lose a job. They've got no fallback. Most Kiwis have got some family somewhere that'll help out. But a lot of these people, and especially if they have a family, there's no fallback. And this is a concern too. Yeah,
what we are trying to do, and as I said, with having Dennis now, the General Secretary of our union, to give confidence to migrant workers that it is good to associate by being union, is that people will join us, and in doing so, find out many of their rights that they didn't know they had even as a resident. Such as their rights to accommodation allowance, their rights to hold not just better wages from their immediate employer, but that sort of thing they can learn both, of course, through us, but also and organisations doing great work like community law centres, citizens advice bureaus. So we are finding that more and more migrants are joining First Union. We've got our own migrant section of our union, as well as them playing their own role. More and more are becoming even delegates and becoming officials, full-time officials of the union. So we're hoping that sends out the message that the union is genuinely a union for all workers, whether you're New Zealand born or whether you have come more recently as a migrant.
Right. Now, I'm Lisa Eyre, and this is Green Planet FM, and today I'm talking to Robert Reid, who is president of First Union and very passionate about making sure that our workers in New Zealand have a good deal. Now, I was interested in Auckland Council because they said that they are very proudly that they are now paying the living wage as opposed to a minimum wage. They're paying a living wage for all their workers. But a lot of the work of Auckland Council is contracted out. And I've found very definite evidence that people who are working as contractors are not actually getting anything like a living wage. So this is difficult, and I'm interested in the whole contractors issue, which Penny Bright had made a lot of when she was not paying her rates and nearly lost her house. She wasn't paying her rates because she said that we as the public have a right to know what the contracts are, what the payments are. All of those details should be out in the public eye on a website somewhere that we can have a look if we're interested. So with that, I began to be quite interested in this contracting idea. And if you've got people competing for contracts, Auckland Council or whoever it is will take the ones that give the lowest price. So therefore, what happens is the workers, as far as I can see, then don't get paid enough because the companies they're working for are trying to say, well, we can do the job, but we'll do it cheap. And the people that suffer are the workers.
You're absolutely right. And contracting out labour hire workers, as we sometimes call them, are the most exploited in the food chain. They don't have, even though we have a 0 hours law prohibiting 0 hours, we still allow companies to, labour hire companies to basically contract to workers sort of on an hour-by-hour basis, even though some of them might be working for an employer or a principal employer. We often find even for 5, 6, 7 years, but still being treated in that casual way. Many issues that you raise in contracting out. Possibly let's start with the council first. Yes, because of the living wage campaign, which you and I talked about a few minutes ago, the Auckland City Council, along with some others in the country, have committed to paying their core staff at least the living wage. That means, though, according to the rules of the living wage movement, they can't yet call themselves to be a living wage employer, because to be a living wage employer, you have to also ensure that all of your contractors are paying the living wage as well. So there have been big campaigns going on, I guess, externally, and a lot of talk internally within the council as well. Just to give an example of sort of how this does affect people, the trading organisation Auckland Transport, which is a trading arm of Auckland Council, it is now required, not because of Auckland Council, but because of central government, to contract out a certain number of the bus runs every year or every few years to ensure that they get the most efficient and best price for bus services. That's a technical term called PTOM, which they're required to do. So they started doing that about 3 years ago. And of course what happens, and it happened first in South Auckland, where the best paying bus company, New Zealand Bus, had the bus run for what was called Waka Pacific. That got tendered out. And it was a company, Go Bus, which paid, hardly had any contracts in Auckland, but around the country was paying some of the lowest rates, won the contract for exactly the reasons that you say. Auckland Bus, I think the workers were over $20. They were being paid overtime after a certain number of hours. They were trying to do something about this terrible thing of split shifts in the middle of the day. Another bus company comes in, Go Bus, and just puts a figure in its calculation saying of the minimum wage or slightly above $17 an hour, wins a contract, puts all of our people out of work, and the tragedy was that Go Bus is actually owned by two iwi, by Tainui and by Ngāi Tahu, and the people that lost their jobs were Maori
Yes.
lost 20-hour-a-week jobs in South Auckland and then had to apply for 17-hour-a-week jobs with no overtime. In fact, what happened there is that so few people applied that, if you like, market forces caused the Go Bus actually had to lift its wages, still behind New Zealand Bus. But it meant that workers, because of this terrible, cancerous contract system, were made, the workers actually lost their jobs, and a company undercutting on wages were able to bring either the old workforce in or a new workforce at lower wages. Inside, we've as First Union, we've been battling that, and we feel we are making some progress, both with the government, the Labor government, who said it will have a look at this PTOM system, and also with Auckland City, and so we think, and in other parts of the country, we have been able to get councils to actually force the contractors, after they've let the contract, to bring up the wages to a decent amount. But transport is just one of them. On the other side, even big organisations like Auckland City and also the government, even if it's not the old contracting out which we oppose, but they also contract and put out whole lots of tenders to build things. And I mean, we're not necessarily saying they need to have a whole building section. It's fine that, they do contract out to a big company to build infrastructure and that sort of thing. But what they are doing now, and especially a very good initiative being made by one of the arms of Auckland City called the Southern Initiative, is actually ensuring and using the term social procurement to make sure that when tenders are let, they are also there are now environmental standards, but there's also social standards, including wages, to go into those contracts. They held a conference here about 3 weeks ago in Auckland. I think they're ahead of the game in New Zealand, and we had people from Wellington and Hutt City Councils, Christchurch City Councils and others coming to that meeting. Australian speakers, because in Australia they're a bit ahead of us on that. So Penny, bless her, has been absolutely correct on what she said. She and you, and I think the rest of us, will be pleased to know that things are moving. They're not there yet, to turn that terrible situation of labour hire, that gross exploitation that can happen through contracting, to turn that around. And I guess as we speak, agencies in Auckland and government agencies are starting to work on those issues now. Well, that's good. I mean, you've talked about people not having enough work, but on the other hand, you've got people that are being drastically overworked, that are working maybe 60, 70, 80 hours a week. Yes, they get overtime, but the reason they do it is because they're not getting enough wage to start with. They get paid for it. They usually don't get overtime as we know it, like time and a half or double time. They just get their normal wage paid on. And you're absolutely right. The reason that we have now this huge dichotomy in New Zealand of an overworked group of people and an underworked group of people. And I'm so suspicious of the unemployment statistics that we are given, because I think, as far as work and income goes now, that even if you get a job for 1 hour a week, you are part, or you're considered to be employed. And what we see and we know has been the First Union in the retail industry, where often your contracted hours can be as low as 5 a week, but you might be working 40 or even 60, But if you just do something that maybe annoys the boss, or you wanted to stay home one day to look after a sick child, and the boss said, no, you come in, and you said, well, I'm not coming in, you might find the following week you're suddenly back to 5 hours a week. And which completely destroys families when you don't know between 5 and 60 how much you're working. So even though this is the terrible regulations which employers often rail against, we believe that there needs to be more regulation back in the labour market to ensure that workers are getting a fair go, and to ensure not just on the question of good wages, but you're quite right to raise the issue of time and hours of work. In some ways, that is just as even more important than the dollar figure. And we found also where we sometimes think we've got a great and in one of the supermarket chains where we thought we had done very well a few years ago in getting some good increase of pay for people, all that happened was that they still had to meet their wages budget, is that our members reported that their hours had been cut. So in some ways they were worse off after our intervention than better off.
That's really tricky. I mean, I can give you an example of somebody working to keep water on in Auckland. I won't mention companies' names, but how it works is the guys work 7:30 in the morning till 4:30 in the afternoon, but they have to finish that job before they go home. So they could be working till 8 o'clock. So it'd be more than a 12-hour day. And every third week, they're on call 24/7. So over New Year, when it was short of staff, the person that I know in this job worked 4 out of 7 days, 24 hours non-stop. Now, those sorts of things shouldn't be allowed, in my opinion. And
in the previous awards, as we called them, prior to 1991, there were regulations that said you actually had to have a certain amount of break. It was either 8 or 9 hours between shifts, particularly if you were on an on-call situation. So, yes, this is a craziness. We get reports at one end of people working so long that I would interrupt myself. I went to Japan and as a guest of their unions and community groups, I think it was in 1989, and learnt this term they had which was called death through overwork, or karoshi. And I thought, this is impossible. How can such a thing exist? But in New Zealand, I think as we've, there's been a couple of coroner cases where it has actually been identified that even this people in New Zealand are working so hard, so many hours, that it is possible that this karoshi could be actually happening in New Zealand as well. Then we have people at the other end not able to get enough hours or being unemployed, and this is a mismatch that we have to do something about. I've agreed for my sins to be on the government's welfare expert advisory group, and one of the areas I said I wanted to do on that group was really looking at the interface between work and the benefit, on the issue of how do we get more people who are unemployed and who want to be in the workforce, to get them there, but in a kind way, not in a way that Work and Income does it now, where it almost seems to be you're punished by a bad job if you happen to be unemployed. So we have to do that, but also we will be looking at the disincentives to get in and what we call the high marginal tax rate, because if you are moving off a benefit into work, you may find that your marginal tax rate on some of the things like working for families combined, maybe you had an accommodation allowance as well, some people are losing as much as even more than 100% for every extra dollar they earn in we call it the marginal tax rate, but essentially it is in losing other benefits, but it has the same effect. Now, can you imagine a person, some of our rich CEOs or executives, if they had a marginal tax rate of 100%? Well, they moan that 33% is too high, but the poorest of the poor here have marginal tax rates. It's an extreme case of 120%, but certainly of 60, 70, 80, and a lot of them at 100%, where you lose $1 for every dollar you earn as a worker. So we have to do something about that as well.
Yes, that's quite complex to understand, as you put it there. But I think that it's from myself, when I was a solo parent with one child and teaching full-time, I couldn't make ends meet because I had childcare to pay. So I started teaching music on Saturday mornings at a Saturday morning school. And after a whole year, I discovered that the tax rate was then higher, and I lost everything I'd done teaching Saturday mornings. So it was even hard back in the 80s from that perspective.
Yes, I think it's got worse, of course, as more and more things have been put on. With the best of intentions to help people at the bottom, as you're moving off those. So we actually have to find ways so that the lowest paid worker should not have a marginal tax rate any more than the highest paid CEO.
And the relationship between benefits and the minimum wage. Can you say something about that?
Yes, it's again right back. This was the period of the 90s, which I mentioned was, I was going to say watershed, but what's the opposite of a watershed? It was the worst of all times for unions, was also the worst of all times for beneficiaries.
It was the mother of all budgets.
So we had the mother of all budgets at the same time, and it wasn't coincidence. It was planned at the same time we had for unions the Employment Contracts Act. Employment Contracts Act was designed, even though they said the opposite, to reduce wages and conditions of workers, and they knew that if that was happening, and this was the national government at the time, if they knew that that was happening, they couldn't have benefits actually higher, they thought, than the wages. So, in fact, they cut, I think it was up to 25% of benefits at time. And some of those benefit cuts, or most of them, still have not been restored. So again, the challenge for this government, the challenge for the welfare expert advisory group that I'm on, is to look at, how do we get benefits back to being just like a living wage. It has to be a living income, because what's the use of keeping people in poverty through just paying half of the amount that they actually need to live? So I think we, again, and there'll probably be a debate about it, some in society, the Scrooges will come up with all sorts of things that, you can't pay a proper income to a beneficiary because otherwise there'll be no incentive to go back to work. I've really not met a person yet who, given the prospect of a good, well-paying job, has not said, yes, I want to do that, and I'm prepared to get off the benefit in order to do that. So that's another issue of our time, but the reason for such low benefits, I think, is really an ideological one. It's part of that war on the poor that we've been having for so many years, and it's based on that misnomer that people will not want to get off the benefit if and into a job. If you want to coax people off the benefit, then let's talk about good jobs, well-paying jobs, and that's far more likely than trying to keep benefit rates low.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think the strict rules of people on benefits about working makes it difficult too, because Materia Toure took in a boarder in the house or whatever it was and got, I forget the exact details, but when she was on the benefit in the early 90s and that budget had come through, and so she didn't have enough to live off, so she needed to do something so that she could live and so that she could attend university. She was doing something to improve her life, which she clearly did do, but it was illegal. And that, to me, seems really wrong. You know, I mean, if you're at home with preschoolers and you can get a job doing some house cleaning or somewhere, something like that, it shouldn't be illegal.
That's right, and that's back to, maybe I was saying in a too complicated way, that money shouldn't then be taken off you if you declare it as an effective marginal tax rate, so you lose every dollar. So I guess the system, yes, I mean, it's good. There's nothing necessarily wrong with requiring that people declare stuff, but you declare it in a way, and you get out of this grey or black economy by having a fair system of not losing every dollar that you've gone and got in order to try and make ends meet and to feed your family, which is what happens at the moment.
Yes. So really, we've got a huge raft of issues around the poor and improving things for the poor, and it's not going to be easy, is it, because of neoliberalism, the whole philosophy that the economy is based on, and that the whole of the Western, well, it's not just the Western world, it's gone worldwide and is causing poverty everywhere, isn't it?
It is, and you're right, it's an ideological opposition. Sometimes that gets masked in a fiscal opposition, but economies should be there for the people. They should be there of a people-centred economy, not the neoliberals trickle-down theory, which was the thing that mattered was making sure businesses do well, and then they will pay their workers well, and the economy will continue. And often when we're attacking neoliberalism, we get being accused of being anti-business. We're not anti-business at all. We actually know we need businesses and it's not the smaller or medium-sized businesses necessary, even though some of them pay less than the big multinationals because they sometimes can't afford to pay more, but it's a whole ideology which often comes from the big multinational companies and certain economists. But again, I'm for the first time, maybe for a number of years, I'm optimistic rather than pessimistic, and we're seeing even some of the traditional economists who peddled for many years a neoliberal line are starting to question that. And I won't necessarily name them, but if you look and you watch the television now when economists come on, yes, you might have the odd bank economist who still peddles the neoliberal line, but almost all of the others are talking about the fact of needing to rebalance society, of actually needing for all workers needing to have a living wage, and there needing to be a living income for people who are not on work. And more that is actually seen as a way forward rather than these, what has it been, 20, 30 years of neoliberalism, which in the end has simply made, I know it's the old adage, but the rich richer, the poor poorer, and some of these multinational companies not even paying a cent in tax in order for us to have a good health system, a good welfare system, a good education system. So much to be done, so much for a new government to be done, but the neoliberal pressures are going to be on that government, and it's really going to have to resist those and stand up and be strong and be firm to say that, and to take up the Prime Minister's word, we want a society based on kindness, not a society based on a dog-eat-dog society or just the survival of the fittest.
Well, Jim Bolger, who was Prime Minister briefly, I think, and leader of the National Party, he has come out and said neoliberalism is a failure. So hopefully there'll be some more national people that will actually begin to get it. And we've still got some Labour people to get it yet, too.
Definitely. Yeah, Jim Bolger was Prime Minister for quite a long time, not a brief time.
Oh, right, okay.
He was Prime Minister in the 90s when those things happened. So there is blood on his hands. I'm glad he's tried to wash that blood off. I hope he's genuine. Maybe he's finally caught up back with his Catholic social justice teachings. Let's hope so. So. The government have put him in charge of one of the committees which is looking to a change in labour law, which made me a bit surprised, but let's see what happens.
Maybe it was because he'd come out against neoliberalism, I don't know. But, it's been really great talking to you, and I really hope that we can get the dialogue going in New Zealand as to why we need trade unions, why people need to join, and get that conversation about the working poor out there much more than it is.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you very much for coming in. That was Robert Reid, President of First Union, interviewed by me, Lisa Eyre, talking about the need for trade unions, the working poor, benefits, how the neoliberal trickle-down theory doesn't work, and how we need business and society to operate with kindness.
I invite you to be able to come to greenplanetfm.com, where we have over 400 interviews in our database, which you can readily download and listen to be able to inspire yourself to become the change you want to see in the world and become involved in caring for your children and grandchildren's future. We are also on Facebook, on Green Planet FM and ourplanet.org. Please come and love us. This is Tim Lynch.
Or Lisa Eyre.
And Liz Gunn.
In the spirit of Aroha, wishing you a wonderful week. We look forward to being with you next week. I say, kia kaha and haere rā.